Welcome to Module 5, Site Constraints and Zones. In this module, we will understand the three zones defined in the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program and learn how to best take advantage of these zones when designing your habitat installation and when you have site constraints. So, what are the three zones used in the program? First, we need to take a step back to discuss why the zones were created in the first place. As you will hear throughout these modules, the goal of the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program is to create self-sustaining and high-quality pollinator landscapes that require minimal maintenance in the long term. The Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program is designed to work with all types of solar facilities across all regions of the state. The program needs to work for sites that are 10 acres and sites that are over 1,000 acres. The program needs to work for brownfields and greenfields. It also needs to work for sites on the eastern shore and sites in the mountains. Each of these situations have different types of site constraints and concerns to address. The program needs to cover these situations and more while also achieving the goal of creating high-quality habitat for native pollinator species. The concept of zones was created to help achieve that level of flexibility and scalability. Prior to the launch of the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program, the team hosted several stakeholder meetings and consulted with other states that have scorecard programs. As a result of those meetings, we decided to include three distinct zones in this program. These zones aren't unique to the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program by any means and are commonly used by vegetation management consultants and solar developers. The zones, as defined by the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program, are the following. The panel zone, which is the area underneath the solar arrays, including the inner row spacing. The open area, which is any area beyond the panel zone but within the property boundary. And the screening zone, which is a vegetated visual barrier. As you can see from our conceptual diagram of a solar site, the screening zone is usually just outside of the fence line. The only exceptional thing to note is that the open area in this program is defined by the property boundary or the area that you have under your control, which almost always translates to the area between the panel zone and the fence line, but there are exceptions. In this drawing, the open area is also located beyond the screening zone. So now what I want to show you is how to take advantage of these three different zones when you have site constraints and how that plays into the scorecards, which are discussed in more detail in Module 7. First, the more pollinator habitat that is being planted, the better for pollinators. We encourage you to install as much habitat as you can at your site. Often planting the entire site with pollinator habitat is actually easier than trying to parcel it out. That being said, we understand that due to site constraints, it may not be possible for all sites to be fully planted in this way. The focus of the rest of this discussion is for those sites where constraints may prevent the entire area from being planted with pollinator habitat. One of the major entry requirements to the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program is that at least 10% of the site is planned to be installed with pollinator habitat. As we discuss the different zones, keep this minimum requirement in mind. Let's start with an example showing the three zones. This is a solar array at Copel Elementary School in Westmoreland County that was developed by SunTribe Solar. It's the first gold certified pollinator smart facility in the state. And just quickly, I want to point out that I adapted this to illustrate my examples, and the acreages presented here are different from the actual site. Using this example, the panel zone, which includes the arrays and inner row spacing, would be identified as such. In this example, that amounts to 8 acres. The open area, which is the area outside of the panel zone and within the property boundary, is shown here as the area between the panel zone and the fencing, because the area outside of the fence is not controlled by SunTribe. This is typical of most sites, but there are a few exceptions to this. That also amounts to 8 acres. The screening zone in this area is outside of the fencing, and it serves as a vegetated visual buffer between the site and adjacent property owners. So we will refer back to the Copel Elementary School site momentarily. First, we need to discuss some instances where you might not be able to plant in one of the three zones. I want to point out the certification levels on the scorecard before we begin. The minimum value you need to be certified is 80 points. In order to be gold certified, you need more than 100 points. Beginning with the screening zone, screening areas aren't always required for solar facilities. Obviously, if it doesn't exist, it can't be planted. And that's okay, because if you can't plant your screening area, you can still earn a maximum of 125 points on the scorecard. In the panel zone, one of the major limiting factors is panel height. The minimum distance between the ground and the panel should be ideally 36 inches at least. It's possible to plant with native species that are in line with the Pollinator-Smart program as low as 24 inches. Below that, especially in the 12 to 18 inch category, it's possible, but it will require some innovation and it may become more expensive to achieve. Overall, it can be difficult to fulfill the requirement when you're dealing with height restrictions. So we encourage you to explore the possibility of planting the panel zone even at lower heights before moving on to an approach that may not fit with the Pollinator-Smart program. I'll discuss in later slides some alternatives to consider. If the panel zone isn't planted with pollinator habitat, you can still earn a maximum of 115 points. The open area is the least restrictive of the zones, and we highly recommend that you maximize your pollinator habitat installations in this area. In nearly all cases, at least part of the open area can be planted. If for some reason the open area cannot be planted, you still score a maximum of 95 points on the scorecard. And also remember that you can always partially plant an area for partial points on the scorecard. For example, if your panel height is low, a possible strategy could be to plant only in the inner row spacing, keeping vegetation away from the bottom of the panels through routine trimming within the 1 to 3 feet near those panels. Planting 50% of the panel zone can give you an additional 8 points on the scorecard. When you aren't planning to install habitat across the entire site, it might be harder to pass the scorecard. The goal of the program is to achieve high-quality habitat to benefit our native pollinators by maximizing points in other areas of the scorecard that's being achieved by a smaller area. With all of that in mind, and going back to copal, we'll begin by assessing what the minimum amount of acreage to be planted is. 10% of the site is 1.75 acres. So that's the minimum of what needs to be installed here in order to qualify to be certified through our program. I presented you with the screening zone on the previous slide showing the site, but it actually doesn't have one. Because of that, there are 15 points that the site can't achieve. And that's okay, because that still leaves 120 points to work with. Let's also assume that there's no habitat features to be preserved. Habitat features can be found in question 10 on the scorecard and include existing bare ground patches 1 square foot or larger with undisturbed and well-drained soil, preserved upland forest communities or forest edge habitat that includes native flowering shrubs and young trees, cavity nesting sites, and preserved wetland communities or the presence of clean water sources. In actuality, the site does have a few of those features, but in this example, let's say there aren't any that are being preserved. It'll all be removed during construction, if it was even present in the first place. That leads to another 20 points that we cannot gain, leaving 100 points that we can still work with. Finally, assume that for some reason we can't plant in the panel zone. It's worth noting that the panel height at copal is actually in that 12 to 18 inch area that I spoke about before. And as I mentioned, it can be difficult to plant pollinator-friendly vegetation in a situation like that. Copal shows that it's definitely possible, though. We recommend working closely with a qualified professional to explore your planting options in this space before fully deciding not to plant with vegetation that's compatible with our program. Back to our example, though. By choosing to not plant the panel zone, we will lose another 20 points. As long as we max out every other option, we can still achieve 80 points on the scorecard and be certified. And in actuality, that can be a long shot, but what we want to illustrate here is that it is possible to plant only one of the 3 zones and still have options available to you in order to be certified through the program. So say that you do have an area that you will not be installing pollinator habitat in. What should you plant there? Traditional turf grass is an option. It can lead to some challenges in adjacent pollinator areas if the turfgrass has the ability to outcompete the species that are being planted, but with the correct vegetation management regime, it is a possibility. There are species that can be beneficial to pollinators, especially non-native pollinators like the European honeybee, that you can use on site. These plants cannot be counted towards the Pollinator-Smart Solar Program for one of the following reasons. They are considered non-native, their native status in the state is uncertain. Although plant species in these categories are not accepted as part of the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program, it doesn't mean that they have to be excluded from the site. It just means that these species will not gain you points on the scorecard towards your certification. Examples are clover and red fescue. Above anything else, stay away from the species of the Department of Conservation, Recreation, Natural Heritage Program's invasive species plant list and tall fescue. These species, if voluntarily added to a site, will outcompete any pollinator habitat that you install, preventing it from establishing and negating the effects of the hard work you put in to design those habitats. And finally, I'd like to add a note on costs and installation. The example we provided you illustrating the 3 zones is small compared to the average utility scale site in Virginia. We know that for some people, you may have looked at the acreages and immediately discounted being able to install pollinator smart habitat on a larger site. At all scales of solar, cost is a huge determining factor when designing pollinator smart landscapes, but especially on the larger end of sites, especially utility scale, since so much area needs to be covered. There are many factors that determine the cost of your installation. Sometimes pollinator-friendly seed mixes cost more than a standard mix, but in other circumstances they can actually cost less per acre. Cost of seed mix depends on the types of species being used and their commercial availability. If designed with price in mind, it's possible to create a mix that costs less than the standard application of Kentucky 31 per acre. Soil amendments are typically not needed for native species installations. If this turns out to be the case for your site, a lot of money is saved in installation costs compared to a traditional installation, where lime and fertilizer is almost always required. Installation of native seed mixes will cost slightly more per acre than a traditional turfgrass installation, primarily because specialized equipment is needed to install native mixes. However, when maintenance costs are considered, that will be less over time for native habitat installations, as the amount of mowing required is significantly less than that of a turfgrass facility. Overall, the biggest cost is incurred when the site is not installed or maintained correctly. So make sure to use a qualified vegetation management contractor with a proven track record for native species installations. Revisiting the goals and objectives of this module, you should now understand the 3 zones defined in the Virginia Pollinator-Smart Solar Program and learn how to best take advantage of those zones when designing your habitat installation. As always, if you have any questions about this module, please reach out to us at the email address below, pollinator.smart@dcr.virginia.gov. See you in the next module.